You may have lived much of your life feeling like there was something wrong with you, as if an invisible piece was missing from the puzzle of your identity. A void that has no shape, but weighs heavily. A silent discomfort, hard to explain, that hides in everyday behaviors. The difficulty in trusting people, the fear of being rejected, the urge to please, the discomfort with your own body, or even with the sound of your voice. All of this often has a root that is not easy to face, the absence of a healthy bond with the maternal figure. And when we talk about absence, we are not necessarily referring to mothers who were physically absent, but to emotional absences. Looks that did not welcome, words that wounded, suffocating expectations, constant judgment, and a presence that, instead of nurturing, drained. Not all the pain we carry comes from major traumas. Some comes from what was missing. And this absence, when unacknowledged, settles in as a silent mark, shaping the way we see ourselves and the world around us. Carl Jung, in exploring the paths of the unconscious, showed that each of us carries archetypal images, deep patterns that transcend time and culture. Among them is the mother archetype, an inner image built from the relationship lived with the real maternal figure, but which often takes on a life of its own within our psyche. When this image is marked by pain, judgment, or abandonment, we create within ourselves an internal mother who, even when the real mother is no longer present, continues to accompany us, demand from us, and often sabotage us. The lack of maternal love leaves wounds that are not always visible, but that scream in the form of insecurity, self-sabotage, and difficulty in establishing authentic bonds. How many times have you found yourself trying to be perfect, just to finally be accepted? How many times have you erased yourself in a relationship just so you wouldn't be left? This kind of behavior is born from a logic learned very early, that love must be earned, that being loved requires effort, sacrifice, and sometimes the denial of who you really are. The child who was not seen grows up thinking they need to hide to survive, and this silent adaptation over time becomes identity. The pain molds itself into the body, the gestures, the unspoken words, until you forget who you were before all of this began. It's not easy to recognize these wounds, because we live in a society that idealizes motherhood, that places the maternal figure on a pedestal, as if every mother were by definition loving, protective, and infallible. But when that expectation clashes with lived reality, an internal conflict is born that paralyzes. Guilt arises as a constant shadow. Am I being ungrateful? Am I exaggerating? She did the best she could. These doubts suppress the pain, silence legitimate anger, and keep us trapped in a cycle where recognizing our own wound is forbidden. The truth, however, is that feeling anger, sadness, or frustration toward your mother does not make you a bad person. It makes you human. The emotional wounds originating from this foundational relationship do not disappear with time. They disguise themselves. They disguise themselves as chronic anxiety, difficulty in maintaining bonds, excessive self-criticism, unbalanced relationships, where pain seems more present than love. And often the origin of all this is an affection that arrived in a distorted, twisted way, or that simply never arrived. This doesn't mean blaming the mother. It means taking responsibility for your own story, with maturity and compassion, because there comes a point where it's no longer about what was done to you, but about what you choose to do with what was done. The construction of a new internal image begins with recognition. Looking inside and realizing that the pain exists, that it has a name and a story, that the voice saying you are never enough, that you always have to try harder, that you cannot fail, is not yours. It is an internalized voice, built over the years based on looks that didn't welcome, silences that hurt, demands that shaped a fragile self-image. This voice can be confronted, but before that, it needs to be identified. Transformation begins the moment you allow yourself to feel. Feel anger, feel sadness, feel the lack, because all of that is part of the healing process. You can't heal what you don't acknowledge. You can't transform what remains denied. Jung said that what we do not face within ourselves eventually manifests in our destiny as something inevitable. If we don't look at the wound, we'll spend our lives trying to fix it in others, in partners, children, friends, when in truth, the healing needs to happen within. Throughout life, it's common to try to find outside what we lacked inside. We seek in relationships the security we didn't have in childhood. We seek in praise the recognition that never came. We mold ourselves to please, hoping that one day someone will look at us with the love we so longed for. But until we free ourselves from the need to be validated by a love that was not given to us in the way we needed, we will continue repeating patterns that hurt us. Healing begins when we understand that we can give ourselves what was denied to us, and that this choice is not selfish, it is liberation. The absence of a nurturing love in childhood doesn't need to determine the script of your life. You can rewrite the story from the moment you decide to look inward with honesty. It's like cleaning a fogged-up lens. Little by little, you begin to see more clearly who you really are and not who you learned to be to please. This reunion with your essence requires courage, but it is also the safest path back home, to yourself. Unrecognized pain doesn't disappear. It camouflages itself. It takes on forms that at first glance seem normal: overproductivity, constant need to please, difficulty expressing boundaries, irrational fear of conflict, repetitive attraction to emotionally unavailable people. It's like living in an invisible theater, where every role is rehearsed to avoid abandonment, rejection, or criticism. And even when everything seems to be working, there is a discomfort deep in the soul, a silent noise that signals something is out of place. That noise is often the echo of the inner child still waiting to be seen, still waiting to hear that they are enough just for existing. By understanding the influence of this wound in adult life, it becomes clearer why so many behaviors we judge as personal flaws are, in fact, deep emotional adaptations. Adapting to the absence of unconditional maternal love often means developing hypersensitivity to others' emotions, constant vigilance over your own gestures, as if each step could trigger rejection. This may look like empathy or excessive kindness, but it is really fear. Fear of being abandoned, of being seen as inadequate, of not being worthy of love. It is living in emotional survival mode, not in a state of wholeness. Within depth psychology, there is a symbolic image that helps to understand this process: the internal mother. It is a psychic figure that represents the way we learn to care for ourselves, to comfort ourselves, and to love ourselves, or not. When this internal mother is harsh, absent, or punitive, we repeat with ourselves the same dynamic we lived in childhood. We become self-critical, impatient, demanding. We hardly forgive ourselves for our own mistakes, and when we hurt instead of comforting, we attack. It's like living with an invisible version of our mother inside our own mind, repeating the same words that once wounded us. You are not enough. You need to do more. You will only be loved if you are perfect. The healing journey, then, involves rebuilding that internal image. It is a symbolic, emotional, and at the same time deeply practical process. It's not about forgetting the real mother or pretending everything was perfect. It's about transforming the internal bond, giving it new meanings, finding new ways to relate to yourself. Imagine an old house with walls that no longer support, with windows locked for years. What is proposed here is not to demolish this house but to renovate it. Make space for the air to enter, let light touch the dark corners, paint the rooms of your identity with new colors. It's common that when starting this process, you encounter intense feelings: anger, sadness, frustration, emotions that may have been suffocated for years because they were considered wrong, because they didn't match the idealized image of the maternal figure. But these emotions need to exist. They are like doors that, when opened, allow the flow of transformation. Feeling anger toward an absent or critical mother doesn't mean lack of gratitude. It means having the courage to recognize yourself as someone who also needed love and who has the right to feel the pain of what was missing. In many cases, this wound is passed on. Men and women who haven't processed their maternal wounds tend to repeat them with their own children, not out of malice, but out of unconscious automatism. They reproduce demands, criticisms, and absences with the same intensity they suffered, even while wanting to do differently. And the most delicate part of all this is that often this pattern is only noticed when the children start showing the same symptoms: low self-esteem, insecurity, emotional neediness. Healing, then, is not just individual, it is also an act of generational love. When you choose to look at your own pain, you are, at the same time, protecting those who came after you. You are breaking a cycle that could last 3, 4, 5 more generations. That's why it's not about blaming the mother. It's about choosing not to be just a consequence. It's about becoming the cause, the agent, the protagonist. And the turning point in this journey usually happens when you stop waiting for an apology that may never come and start offering yourself what you always needed: comfort, validation, emotional security. What hurts the most is not what happened, but what you keep doing with what happened, often treating yourself the same way you were treated. The invitation is to break this cycle, to take a conscious step toward yourself. If you saw yourself in any part of these words, if at any moment you felt the urge to take a deeper breath, to close your eyes, to revisit your own story, I invite you to take a conscious pause. Breathe. And if you feel like it, share in the comments not just your story, but a small gesture of commitment to yourself. It can be a phrase, a symbol, a word, something that represents your desire to heal, to be free, to rewrite your narrative. It can be something simple like, "Today I begin with myself," or something more personal. This sharing is important because by naming it, you make it real. And by sharing, you help other people recognize that they are not alone. And of course, if this video is helping you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, the intention is not just to inform, it's to transform, and you are part of that. Together, we are building a space of support, awareness, and emotional healing. When you decide to start this journey of emotional reconstruction, it's natural to feel uncertain. After all, for many years, you may have lived under rigid internal rules that dictated what should be felt, said, or silenced. Emotional re-education doesn't happen in a straight line, and this needs to be understood from the beginning. There are days when everything feels clear. You feel light, safe, and confident. On others, old behaviors return as if nothing had changed. But this is not a setback. It's part of the process. It's the psyche testing new paths, new ways of existing in the world. And at this point, self-compassion is just as important as self-knowledge. Because it's not about reaching a perfect version of yourself, but about embracing every part of you that was left behind. An important tool on this path is symbolic practice. The unconscious responds better to images, metaphors, and gestures than to rational explanations. That's why symbolic rituals such as writing a letter to the mother you had, with no intention of sending it, are powerful. There, you can name your pain without filters, without justifications. You can allow all repressed emotions to find an outlet. You can say what you couldn't say when you needed to. You can acknowledge what marked you, what was missing, what was too much. And when that emotional material is released, part of the weight begins to dissolve. What matters is not the aesthetics of the letter, but the honesty of what is said. Other symbolic methods also have deep value. The empty chair technique, for example, consists of imagining your mother sitting in front of you and allowing a dialogue to happen. It may seem strange at first, but this practice enables a genuine emotional catharsis. You speak, but you also listen. You respond, confront, cry, fall silent. It doesn't matter whether the real mother is still alive or not, whether there is closeness or distance. What is being worked on is not the external relationship, but the internal bond. And that, yes, can be transformed. Jung spoke of the individuation process as the essential journey of the human soul, the path toward integration, where all fragments of the personality are gathered into a conscious unity. When you recognize that there is a wounded child within you, still seeking acceptance and care, you begin to create space for that child to finally be welcomed. And this happens when the adult you've become takes on the role of caregiver. An adult who does not judge, who does not repeat the abandonment, who learns to say, "You are safe with me now." This is individuation in practice. This is the birth of a new internal center. Perhaps one of the most liberating aspects of this process is realizing that you no longer need to beg for affection, that you no longer need to prove your worth, that you no longer need to perform in order to deserve presence. You are no longer that helpless child. You've grown, And with that growth comes the possibility of seeing yourself through different eyes. Eyes that understand the story but are not bound by it. Eyes that acknowledge the pain but don't allow it to define the future. The construction of a new self-image also involves rescuing everything that was silenced. Your talents, your sensitivity, your voice, your desires. Many of these expressions were stifled because at some point they were not welcomed. Maybe you were a spontaneous child, but were told you were inappropriate. Maybe you were sensitive but were labeled as weak. Little by little, you shaped yourself into what was allowed, into what created less conflict. And today, as an adult, you still carry these limitations as if they were part of your nature. But they're not. They are just conditionings, and they can be broken. As you reconnect with who you truly are, you begin to notice subtle changes. Your posture in relationships transforms. You no longer accept emotional crumbs. You no longer stay silent when something hurts you. You no longer feel like you need to dim your light to fit in. Self-esteem stops being a concept and becomes a practical, everyday experience. You learn to say no firmly, to choose yourself without guilt, to protect your emotional space as one protects something sacred. This new way of living also changes how you see your mother. Maybe for the first time you can see the woman behind the maternal figure, a woman with her own pain, frustrations, and limitations. This doesn't invalidate what you went through, but it allows anger to transform into understanding, and understanding to open the way to forgiveness, a forgiveness that doesn't depend on external reconciliation, but on internal liberation. Forgiving here doesn't mean forgetting, doesn't mean justifying. It means releasing the emotional chain that still ties you to a past that cannot be redone. And when that forgiveness happens, even if silently, you feel that something changes. The energy that was once used to suppress feelings begins to be used to build. A new desire emerges to live with more authenticity, more presence, more truth, and that is the greatest sign that healing has begun. There are no magic snaps, no guarantees of perfection, but there is awareness. And with awareness, any story can be rewritten. As you walk this internal path, you realize that the love you so long sought no longer needs to come from the outside. It can begin with a simple gesture, listening to yourself, listening to what you feel without rushing to fix it, listening to your memories without needing to judge them, listening to your intuition without trying to silence it. Silence, when used consciously, can be a fertile ground for the rebirth of the self. Internal listening is one of the deepest forms of healing because for a long time your pain screamed into the void, and now it finds a space where it can finally be heard. It's not uncommon that, along this journey, the fear of losing existing bonds arises. After all, when you begin to choose yourself, to say no, to prioritize your emotional health, some relationships that fed on your self-abandonment tend to shake. But this movement isn't about rupture, it's about realignment. Healthy relationships withstand the truth. Genuine bonds adapt to growth. What falls apart when you stand up for yourself was not love, it was dependence, it was control disguised as care. What remains when you show who you are, that deserves to be nurtured. This path also reveals the importance of boundaries, and sometimes boundaries need to be set even in the relationship with your own mother. A boundary is not disrespect, nor cold emotional distance. It is a way of saying, here is where yours ends and mine begins. It could be temporary physical distance, an honest conversation, or simply a new internal stance. It could be the simple act of no longer allowing certain words to define you. When you understand that protecting your emotional space is also an act of love, for yourself and for others, the fear of displeasing begins to fade. As you rebuild this inner space with more awareness, you'll notice that you no longer react the way you used to. Situations that once triggered emotional storms are now faced with more presence. That doesn't mean you don't feel pain. It means you've learned to walk with it without letting it decide your destiny. The wound may still exist, but it has become a story, no longer a prison. It is now a memory that teaches, no longer a chain that limits. And when you begin to live in this new state of presence, something extraordinary happens. You feel at home within yourself. This is the point where individuation begins to manifest as a daily experience. It is not an abstract concept. It's something revealed in your relationships, in your choices, in the way you deal with your own mistakes and successes. You no longer need to play a role. You can be whole. You can have good days and bad days. You can be vulnerable without fear of rejection. You can shine without fear of bothering others. You can love without needing to disappear. You can make mistakes without losing your worth. That is emotional freedom. That is healing. And if you're hearing these words and feel that, for the first time, someone is putting into voice what you've always felt, that's not a coincidence, that's connection. And that connection is not just with me, it's with your own story. Because no one gets to this point by chance. If you're here, it's because a part of you is already ready to change. It doesn't have to be now, it doesn't have to be all at once. But the simple fact that you've made it this far is already an act of courage, an act of self-love. So, if this video touched you, if it inspired you, if it opened a clearing inside your inner world, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we talk about real life, about soul, about new beginnings. Here you will find reflections, tools, and an entire community of people who, like you, are seeking to rebuild themselves with truth, not with magic formulas, but with depth and meaning. The healing of the soul begins when we find the courage to look within. And does it ever end? Maybe not. Maybe it's a continuous process in motion like life itself. But every step you take toward your center is a step that brings you closer to what is true, to what is light, to what is yours. Thank you for walking this far. I'll see you in the next video.